Alright, a long time ago I made a two-part video review of the Broken Sword adventure game series, one of my favorite adventure game series. This was done in the lead up to the 5th game of the series coming out, The Serpent's Curse, which I never made a video for, though I did review it on my blog. But since nobody reads my blog and it's been sufficiently long time since anything Broken Sword related has been at all relevant, I felt I might as well finally have a full set of video reviews on these games, even if parts 1 and 2 have the Bandicam watermark permanently implanted on them. Okay, as always, let's begin with the story. And I'll keep it short this time because people always get uppity in the comments about spoilers, even for a 20-year-old video game. So this game follows up on George, for whom the wheel of ever-changing professions has landed on the insurance salesman sector. George is overseeing his client's art show in Paris, where he meets Nico again, when the painting suddenly gets stolen and the gallery owner, Henry, gets killed. George begins solving the murder and quickly begins to find out that the theft was an inside job, most likely organized by Mr. Medovsky, the purported owner of the painting La Maledicción. However, Nico meets an old Spanish man, Senor Marquet, who claims to be the real owner of the painting. George is told that the painting contains symbols relating to a religious sect called the Gnostics, and that it points to an artifact called the Tabula Veritatis. And the bad guy eventually turns out to be this guy. We'll come back to him later in the review. So, you might remember how in part 2 of my Broken Sword series review, I basically mentioned how The Angel of Death was like the worst game made by human hands. Well, luckily Serpent's Curse is a little bit better. It was crowdfunded by Revolution, much like Tim Schafer's Broken Age, and also much like Tim Schafer's Broken Age, was also released in 2 parts. This is not the only similarity, but I mention this simply because it's kinda obvious how different the two halves are. The game returns to the style of the first 2 games, though the characters are 3D rendered and the backgrounds are 2-dimensional. This kind of reminds me of Runaway, which of course is one of my favorite adventure games. Unfortunately, this comes with its fair share of problems. The game does suffer from rather generous helping of graphic bugs with the pre-rendered characters, and some of the inventory items do blend annoyingly into the background, but at the very least, all the backgrounds are detailed and look very nice. Barrington Fallon also returned to score the game, and as a result the soundtrack is really good, albeit it also recycles a lot of music from the first game, The Shadow of the Templars, but honestly, I don't mind. Now, another aspect where Revolution was clearly trying to bang home that they were making a game for longtime fans was in including several characters from past games. In the first half, we have Sergeant Moo, Fleur the Flower Seller Lady, and Lady Piermont making cameos, as well as the art critic Lane from Broken Sword 2 in a substantially larger role, as well as a few background cameos. And in the second half, we have the grand return of the Hendersons, who last appeared together in the second game, though Dwayne did cameo in the previous title. Despite these cameos, though, I have to say Andre Lobeno being absent for the second game in a row is honestly quite unacceptable. I do feel having a lot of these older characters is a bit unfair for any new gamers jumping in, as the game does feature a lot of in-jokes that will fly straight over your head if you haven't played at least the first 2 games, but I will say that Sergeant Moo is just a joy to see again regardless. Conversely, the new characters are, honestly, not very interesting. Okay, the wife of the gallery owner, Bijou, as well as her artist fling Hobbs are at least somewhat likable, and the idiotic Inspector Nabe is at least good for a few cheap laughs. But the problem is that these characters all stop being relevant after the first half, once the art theft conspiracy is wrapped up with the second half of the game focusing on George and Nico's search for the tabula. And this is where I think the biggest weakness of the game comes into play, which is sadly the story. Okay, it starts off kinda interesting. It really resembles the first game's plot a little too much, just focusing on the Gnostics rather than the Templars this time. I do think the narrative and historical exposition is handled a lot better than in The Angel of Death, but ultimately the bad guys, well, they're a bit weird. Medovsky in particular, I mean, just look at him. He's literally just the Broken Sword version of Vladimir Putin. The similarities are so cartoonishly obvious, I honestly feel like Revolution just gave up on trying to give him a genuine personality, because the most evil person they could think of was Putin, apparently. And then there's the second villain, Langham, or Gainen, the grandson of an evil Swiss guy who tried to find the tabula back in the Spanish Civil War. This guy is just not very interesting. He has maybe 4 scenes in the game where he's present. Honestly, even compared to the villains of the Angel of Death, he somehow comes off much less interesting. Now, another interesting contrast between the two halves of the game are the puzzles, and rather the stark difference in difficulty. The first half of the game is honestly a little too easy, even by the series standards, which I'll remind you are not known for having especially complicated puzzles. I think this is in part because you have so few locations you travel between. But even then, the items you need to solve a puzzle are usually just lying around. And I get the feeling that for the second half, Revolution realized this and therefore made the puzzles a lot harder. There are puzzles where you have to observe items closely, decipher coded messages, and generally the second half of the game is a lot less transparent. And while this was honestly a bit of a relief, a couple of the puzzles did leave me scratching my head, like playing Ave Maria on paint cans. And honestly, deciphering the symbols on the tabula was so convoluted that I indeed ended up using the hint tool, which actually just flat out tells you the solution by the end. Now don't get me wrong, I do appreciate the hint tool. It definitely makes sure that you won't get stuck. But I'm also a little stunned by how hard that tabula puzzle is, because I could only honestly decipher a few of the symbols correctly by myself. Overall, Broken Sword 5 is a bit of a mixed bag. I do think its puzzles, music, and even some of the characters are pretty fun and interesting. I also think the story is paced very well, but the finale is honestly my least favorite part of the whole experience. Also, while the first half is too easy, I honestly feel the second half is almost a little too cryptic in places, which is to say, the game just doesn't find a good balance. However, the voice acting is top-notch, the comedy is on point, and there are some genuinely curious history bits. However, I do have to be honest and say that I absolutely prefer the Shadow of the Templars and the Sleeping Dragon over this. And even if the finale of the Smoking Mirror might have been a bit rushed, I do think it's more entertaining in the long run. However, it's a passable adventure game and certainly head and shoulders above the 4th title at any rate. So, lightly recommended if you like the prior entries, but not a classic. And that's all from me for now. I'm TheHande, and see you on the next one.
Florist's foam, flower food, ribbon, pee-pee, bouquet labels. Pee-pee? My curiosity was aroused.